And people had had strange experiences around there, and following us in the dark, we ran down the mountain back to our vehicles. To introduce myself, I'm Matt Pruitt, and I have been involved with pursuing the Sasquatch phenomenon for a long time. You know, starting with an experience I had when I was very young. I was 17 years old, and that occurred where I grew up in the Northeast Georgia mountains in the summer of 1999. And, you know, we didn't see the things that we encountered, but we heard sounds that I later learned were consistent with the sounds and sort of the behaviors that are attributed to Sasquatches. And so it prompted a bit of a question of like, well, could these animals possibly exist? Is there a biological reality behind the Sasquatch mythos or the folklore, let's say? And so it really began for me in about 2002 with interviewing local witnesses and trying to find historical references, you know, newspaper archives, things of that nature. And then that's just grown over the years. So, you know, I met with other researchers in the Southeast, and then I joined the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization in 2007. And through that process, traveled the country a lot and worked on episodes of Finding Bigfoot. And then, you know, I maintain a close relationship with Cliff and Bobo. I produce and edit their podcast, Bigfoot and Beyond, with Cliff and Bobo. And then in 2016, joined the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, where, you know, I've been an investigator and part of their camera corps, essentially there for years. So I've worn a lot of hats and stayed very involved in a lot of different ways over all this time. So trying to condense all those years into a quick summary is a little difficult, but yeah, that's essentially been the story in a nutshell.
Wow. Well, I'm impressed. That's a lot. But let's go back to this encounter, these sounds that you heard when you were 17. Tell me the circumstance around that.
Certainly. Well, you know, if any of your listeners have heard that before, I apologize, because I know I've told it many times over the last, 16 years or so that I've been speaking publicly about the subject. But, you know, just to summarize it very quickly, we were interested in looking into some of these places that were associated with unusual phenomena, where I grew up there again in the southern Appalachian region of North Georgia. And so there were some stories, some folklore, let's say, about this one particular mountain where strange things purportedly occurred. And so 5 of us went up there one night, and there was the lore surrounded this particular abandoned cabin that was up on this mountain, and people had had strange experiences around there. And so we had established a little base camp at the bottom of the mountain at night. It was sort of on a whim. We made the decision after dark, you know, we're looking sort of for something to do and knew we wanted to go camping and thought, oh, we should go to this place and try to find that cabin. You know, it'd be fun and exciting and adventurous, and as young people are wont to do. So we set up this camp and tried to hike up this mountain. Had no idea where on the mountain the cabin was. Tried to locate it, but essentially, yeah, we heard at least 2 individuals that were 2 somethings, let's say, that were following us in the dark, a very, you know, dense forest at night. These things didn't have lights, and so we were fairly convinced that it wasn't people that were following us or stalking us. And they were hearing sounds like branches being broken, and you could hear them being ripped from trees and then hit against trees. And, you know, we had no idea what wood knocks were, never really explored the Sasquatch phenomenon or mystery or anything of that nature. Heard vocalizations in the, you know, consistent with what people would define as whoops, or these, heard one particular long moaning howl. And then at one point, amidst this activity, a large tree was broken and crashed very close to us. And so long story short, we ran down the mountain back to our vehicles, abandoned our camp, drove back to the house I grew up in, my mom's house, which was only a few miles away, and didn't come back for our stuff until the next day. And again, it was consistent with what people described, these sort of strange, unexplainable happenings, things you couldn't just attribute easily to other animals, you know, deer, bear, etc. And I used to go back very often, trying to see if that same series of events or something like it would occur again. And it never did. And even back then, I used to go alone sometimes at night. And it wasn't until later that I discovered Sasquatch information online. And I really thought it was preposterous. The whole proposition was ridiculous, you know. But then as I was reading the testimonies of people that claim to have encounters, so many of the elements that they described, the experiential elements, were similar to what we experienced. And the sounds that they heard or claimed to have heard were similar in description. And then purported audio recordings, sounds attributed to Sasquatches were very similar to what we had heard. So that began the process of trying to pursue an answer to, this mystery essentially. And so, like many people, when I first got involved, it was very, oh yeah, we'll get this figured out right away. And then once I became familiar with the state of the subject at that time, I thought, oh, I'm essentially too late, because any day now, someone's going to make this discovery and it's going to be settled. And, that was 20 plus years ago. And so here we are still exploring this question.
Well, I think that's interesting as well. I'm kind of new in the field myself, but have done a lot of interviews, and it reminds me of a lot of other mysteries in the world. You think you're right on the brink of an answer, and then there is no answer. Why do you think it's taking so long to get more concrete evidence or answers to this?
Well, how much time do you have? Because I think there's no simple answer to a question like that, because there are so many factors that play into that we could essentially try to pinpoint one, but it would really be almost a complex of reasons. And I think for the most part, a lot of it has to do with the fact that there aren't many people that are diligently trying to collect evidence that would rise to the standard of the institutions who would essentially deem that evidence valid or invalid. And so, part of this book that I recently released this year called The Phenomenal Sasquatch does sort of cover a lot of that, especially in the beginning, to sort of describe, well, why is the subject in the state that it's in? Because you have these sort of paradoxical states occurring simultaneously, in that for as long as we can look back in time, you have many individuals who claim to have made discoveries, although they are personal discoveries. Now, whether that's an observation or an encounter where someone has seen something or been very close to something, that's a sort of a personal discovery. You could say that person has discovered a Sasquatch, at least according to their claims. And we might accumulate a mountain of such testimonies, and yet our society essentially relies on institutional authority to sort of sign off, I guess you could say, on such discoveries. And, we have to do that, because most of the time discovery is sort of the product of a consensus arrived at by multiple entities or individuals within institutions, sort of, through the scientific method, testing repeatability, et cetera, to see if the same phenomena emerges across different methodologies. And so we have this state where the institutions, academia, science, let's say, the government, does not accept the de facto discovery, as John Bitternagel would have said, that the Sasquatch exists as a species of animal or a species of living creature. And yet you have all these individuals. And institutions have made it pretty clear what constitutes evidence. They have a certain set of standards, and they're very, very high standards, obviously. It's claims are not enough. And descriptions of experiential descriptions of encounters and the things that people heard or smelled or felt, or the way that they interpret what they consider to be sign, those things don't rise up to those standards. So you do have, on this individual side, this mountain of claims and evidence that they interpret as evidence for the corporeal existence of the Sasquatch, but institutions don't accept those. And so it is the case that, very few people have tried to offer evidence, or even very often go after evidence that would rise to that institutional standard. Now, in their defense, the institutions make it nearly impossible, because clearly when you're pursuing any sort of phenomena, there are precursors to maybe what we would call like absolute proof. And so we've all seen this in the subject very often, where there is a bit of a circular logic that happens, where en route, let's say, to discovery, you're finding clues along the way. Trace evidence is a great example. And so we have that in great abundance. We, as Sasquatch contenders, let's say, and we've all had these sort of experiences where maybe we're trying to present something to an expert in a relevant discipline or a relevant field to say, well, I have something that I would like you to take a look at and give your opinion or analysis, or to evaluate. And they'll say, well, what is it that you think you have? And, the conversation might go something like, oh, well, we think it might be connected to the Sasquatch, and, oh, well, the Sasquatch doesn't exist, so I don't have to look at that because it can't possibly be associated with it. You say, okay, well, what would it take for you to consider that it might exist? And, oh, well, I need to see evidence. It's like, well, what about this? Oh, well, that can't be evidence because they don't exist. Well, what would make you change your mind? Oh, well, I need to see evidence. And so there certainly is a tremendous amount of evidence, supportive evidence, suggestive evidence. And again, a lot of it is subjective because it does require at least some familiarity with certain disciplines or certain fields, and it does require interpretation. It's not self-evident or obvious proof. And so I think we've been stuck in that sort of stagnant, paradoxical state for a long time. And many contenders, proponents, researchers really enjoy staying within the experiential realm. And I've done that myself for many years too. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than having those sorts of experiences that can be, I mean, first of all, they are transformative very often. Like myself, many other researchers started pursuing this because they had an experience that they couldn't reconcile through some other like prosaic means. And so in trying to pursue that answer, to find out, get to the bottom of that mystery, let's say, they have other experiences along the way, and that can be sort of a fuel that propels you to continue searching. But a lot of people stay within that realm, and there's, again, nothing wrong with that. But as long as you're staying within that realm with the understanding that no amount of personal experiences or the descriptions of those personal experiences will ever really sway those institutions in any way, shape, or form. And, not to belabor the point too much, but I think many people feel so sort of pessimistic about the eventuality that institutions will pay attention, that they're just content to say, well, I'm not interested in gathering proof. I'd rather just stay in a position where I might see something and might hear something and continue on their own personal journey of discovery, which is what a lot of people do. And again, there's nothing wrong with that so long as it's clearly delineated from collective discovery, i.e., our society, the world recognizes that such a thing exists, versus a personal discovery, which is, again, just on an individual basis, that individual gets to choose what defines proof to them.
In all of your research that you've done and all the experience that you've had over these years, what's been the most surprising point or element of the Sasquatch, or even of society's opinion of Sasquatch?
I guess the most surprising thing, it's hard to say because it has been so long that, first of all, the whole proposition is rather surprising. How could it be that if such animals do exist? And I try to keep it within that realm because obviously, I'm convinced of a number of things. But can I prove that? Well, not at this point, no more than anyone else has been able to. Now, some people have offered very compelling evidence, but it is for society at large still a question. Again, individuals claim like to know that such things exist because they've experienced them firsthand. I've never seen one, so I don't have that degree of like gnosis, let's say, like direct internal knowledge of their absolute reality. But people might ask, like, well, how could it be that things like this could live and yet we don't recognize their existence, or that we don't know that they exist? And I think the surprising thing is that when you walk people through the history of claims and observation claims and encounter claims, et cetera, and the wealth of physical items that are touted as evidence, it becomes pretty overwhelming that something is going on. And it's surprising that so much of that is unknown to the general public. Even a lot of the interested public, people who, do pay attention to Sasquatch research or, follow the phenomenon, let's say, aren't aware of all that, of just how much there is. And so when you really become intimately familiar with all of that data, you realize that, one of the points I make in the book that gets brought up so often in just years of speaking is that, you could put together a profile of this hypothetical creature, these animals, let's say, this species, based on eyewitness accounts. And we have thousands of those accounts for review. Now, no one knows how many of them, if any of them, are completely accurate or not, because they're all like brief little glimpses, short sightings, brief insights maybe into behavior and ecology. But nonetheless, you can build this profile that's the result, the consequence of analyzing all those reports. And then people will look at this sort of representation that you've built and they'll say, well, don't you think something like that, if it existed, people would see it more often? How does it remain undetected? And so you'd have to say, well, if you believe any of these people, then they're hardly undetected because people are encountering them and people are seeing them and have been for centuries, if not millennia. And so that's sort of the surprising thing is how difficult it is to sort of break through the resistance that occurs at that initial stage for people, that first contact. And I understand it because I had it too. Like I said, when I first encountered Sasquatch information, I thought it was preposterous. And I think a lot of that is because, we take these narratives, the testimonies of witnesses, let's say, and we're seeing those through this lens that's culturally oriented in terms of all the schlocky movies we've seen, all the bad horror movies with the terrible suits, the terrible Bigfoot suits, and the Sasquatches are like ripping people's arms off, these really over the top bad B movies. That's one kind of representation. Or there's, again, this really comical sort of goofy caveman troglodyte sort of creature. And we're constantly, at least upon first contact, people hear these stories and they're seeing that sort of, that's what gets like transmuted in their minds as the cultural representations of the Sasquatch, which are, not very biologically grounded, let's say. And so, when they hear those stories, they're basically thinking like, oh, so you think you've seen this spooky campfire monster, this B movie, horror antagonist, And so I understand the resistance, but that is the surprising thing, is that over these years, even though more and more information has been accumulated, there's still a lot of resistance and a general unawareness in just the broader public, just about how much information there is. And that was part of the motivation of writing the book the way that I did, because people would ask very often, like, well, what should I read if I want to learn about this subject? And I would have, a list of like the top 5. And once you finish those, let's expand that out into another additional 5 or 8 or 10 or whatever the case may be. And so I really wanted to challenge myself to try to put everything into one book so that if someone was brand new to the subject, it would provide just sort of like a bottom up, as thorough an education as I'm capable of offering, so that if someone only ever read one book, it could be this one, and they would at least have a pretty thorough understanding of the entirety of the subject as such, at least as much as you can fit into 300 pages there. But I never cease to be surprised by that element of it, is the sort of knee-jerk dismissal and lack of I guess awareness, again, in the face of 70 years of books and things that have been presented on television, documentaries, documentary series, documentary films, on and on and on. There's a lot of information out there, but people are not very familiar with much of it, at least in the general public.
So historically speaking, since I know you went back and kind of took a broader view of this subject, what do you think are a few significant points historically about Sasquatch that we would need to know?
Well, that could be the subject of an entire, few hour discussion. So I guess the things that would be the most significant in my perspective would be that, obviously when we're talking about, pre-Western contact, pre-European contact, we do have these artistic representations of various indigenous peoples across North America, as well as oral traditions that seem to represent ape-like creatures. Now, again, a lot of those require some degree of interpretation, and because oral tradition is spoken and transmitted that way, we don't have externalized representations of that, so they weren't written down. So we don't know exactly how old these particular stories are, but we do know that when non-natives arrived into North America, they began to record some of these stories, and then we do have these artistic representations. So it's fascinating that you have these ape-like creatures, or ape-like characters at least, represented as far back as you can look, essentially, in this North American history. And then you have this influx from these other cultures, these Western cultures, who essentially, in some cases, were mandated to eradicate and supplant the belief systems, essentially to convert indigenous peoples to this European or Western way of thinking. And so they're essentially trying to dismiss these indigenous beliefs. And very often they were very dismissive of the ape-like creatures or the ape-like characters in these narratives. And you'll see them very often referred to as, superstitions, like, oh, well, they have these superstitions about these, hairy giants or these large creatures that come in the night, and they have, feet a foot and a half long, and these descriptions that we would consider to be consistent with the Sasquatch. And yet, even though the non-natives are trying to dismiss that, they're saying, but by the way, we've encountered, these things that they might call, the terms vary, but, wild men, mountain devils. In the Southeast, booger is used very often, derivative of boogie, like boogeyman. So you have wood boogers or woolly boogers, hair covered boogers, let's say. So I think that's significant in that you have peoples of various cultures, various belief systems, entirely different worldviews and interpretive schemata, yet describing the same phenomenon, albeit via different terms in the same geographic regions, the same places. And that's very significant. And then as the testimonies are becoming more, I guess you would say, specific, because in those earlier days, they're sort of generalized because there are stories that are passed down, or they're describing having encountered the stories that had been passed down. And then when you get into the era of print media, it becomes a lot more specific, because then those become direct reports, direct observation claims. So you have people, you can say this person, associated with a name and a place, saw this thing on this day at this place. And so they're really specific to the individual occurrence or the individual event. And those become very fascinating to read through, because oftentimes they predate a lot of our current understanding of the known great apes. And so they're describing things, maybe behavioral elements or physiological, morphological elements that are totally consistent with what we know about great apes and some fossil apes as well, not just the living apes, but extinct apes. And yet at a time when, well, they couldn't possibly have had the knowledge of that. There would have been no real world inspiration, because these animals weren't very well understood. Some of them hadn't been discovered. Some of these fossil forms hadn't been unearthed yet. And so you think, oh, well, there is something about these reports that is accurately predictive. Now, a lot of those reports are fabricated. There was sort of, I guess you could say, like the precursor to tabloid journalism going on. And I reference one of those reports in the book. But I think that's very historically significant in that it shows that there's this unbroken timeline of people claiming to have seen animals fitting this description, exhibiting the same behaviors or similar behaviors, and having the same general appearance in the same specific geographical regions of North America. Again, an unbroken timeline, and describing things that are now in accordance with our understanding of apes, and yet at a time when they couldn't possibly have just, borrowed certain descriptions from the literature because the literature didn't exist. I think that's highly significant, and that's a focus of a few portions of the book as well.
What do you think they are?
Well, I definitely think, if Sasquatches exist, they are some species of ape. Now, it's yet to be determined that they exist. Obviously, that's the question we're all trying to pursue. Whether an individual has made a personal discovery, I'm talking about the collective discovery. We as a human society, let's say, the descriptions describe a non-human ape. When you look at the physiology, the very large animals covered in hair, and so covered in hair is a potential clue. The individuals that seem to be females have mammary glands, which is being covered in hair, and mammary glands it places you in the category of mammalia. And then what kind of mammal are we looking at? Well, they're devoid of claws. They don't have a tail. They have a fairly flat face. They don't have, pronounced pointed ears, etc. And so when you stack up all these sort of bullet points that people describe, they're most consistent with a hominoid, an ape. And then the question is, well, if that's true, if they do exist and they are apes, what kind of ape are they? Where would they fall in this sort of family tree? And I think that's a very interesting question, and people have been speculating about that forever. Are they something very closely related to us? Are they within our genus? Are they a more distantly related species or a distantly related genus? Perhaps it's something we've not even yet discovered, because, statistically speaking, very few genera and species are represented in the fossil record. So you could say, well, statistically speaking, if they exist, the most likely candidate would be one that we've not yet found in the fossil record, or that is represented in another extant genus or species. But because it's very difficult to have sort of a hypothesis based in the unknown like that, I'd say, well, we could look at the fossil record and the extant apes and say, well, what's the sort of closest fit that we have to at least serve as like an explanatory mechanism or a hypothetical model that these things could have emerged from. And we do know that there was a clade of very large apes that existed in Asia for a very long time, represented currently by two genera, Indopithecus, which occurred in Pakistan and India, and that's roughly 8.6 million years ago, roughly gorilla-sized apes, although we only have a number of teeth and one mandible, one jawbone. And then this younger related form, Gigantopithecus, which we currently are only aware of one species of, Gigantopithecus blacki, from multiple fossil sites in Southeast Asia, even extending down now into Java, Indonesia. And, we don't know a tremendous amount about these apes, but we do know that they lived in, especially Gigantopithecus, that particular genus lived in closed canopy forests with very dense understories, and they had a very broad, diverse diet. And so, these big, massive apes, as far as we can tell, were the largest apes that ever lived. We don't know much about their locomotion because there's no post-cranial remains other than jaws and teeth. But at least from those bits, we can determine, that they did have a broad generalist diet, and they had a large distribution. And again, that clade over a long period of time from about 8.6 million years ago until, there's a paper published very recently that posits that a number of these Gigantopithecus teeth, I think it was 5 in this one particular site, they're offering a date of somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 years ago, which is fairly recent, geologically speaking. And they co-occurred with Homo erectus for over 1 million years in many of these places in Asia, and were probably contemporaneous with early Homo sapiens. And so in that model, you have these very large apes that live in very dense forests with a broad diet that lived alongside, essentially our ancestors, and had a very wide distribution over a very large portion of Asia. And so that's a good model because it shows that such things at least are possible in nature. Because a lot of people just reject the notion, well, how can an ape achieve those sizes? Because gorillas, chimps, and orangutans are nowhere near as large as people claim the Sasquatch is. And how could something live alongside us, without being outcompeted for resources or something of that nature? And yet, we have at least this model. Now, I think a lot of people have tried to take that proposition and say that, well, Sasquatch is Gigantopithecus blacki. And I would never, that's not specifically the hypothesis I would offer. The way that I frame it in the book and the way that I've tried to describe it for years in interviews like this would be to say, a clade will produce a number of genera, and, a genus will produce a number of species. And thus far, we're only aware of 2 genera within this clade. So there would have been more. There would have been other genera of these large Asian apes, and then each genus would produce a radiation of species. So there would have been more Gigantopithecines than just Gigantopithecus blacki. It's just that of the available fossil evidence, this is what we know thus far. And we also do know now through proteomics, which is a sort of comparative protein analysis, sort of like a low proxy or a low resolution proxy for DNA. If you can't extract DNA, maybe it's old or degraded, then you could at least compare proteins and see relatedness. So we know that Gigantopithecine were related to the living orangutan, and they would have diverged from a common ancestor about 10 to 12 million years ago. It's a very long time, a lot of divergence there. Oftentimes you'll see Gigantopithecus depicted as just a large orangutan, and I think that's probably terribly inaccurate because that far back of a divergence, they would have been markedly different animals. But so you could say that, well, maybe there were other forms of Gigantopithecus that were more or less, Sasquatch-like. And so the fact that many animals from Asia came into North America via Beringia at many different points in time, across the Miocene and the Pleistocene, et cetera, and vice versa. There were animals that went from North America into Asia. It makes that proposition at least plausible. It's not an impossible proposition. It's a possible proposition, and given that other animals from this faunal complex made it over, it's a plausible one. And so when you're looking at the fossil record saying, well, if the Sasquatch is real, is there anything that it might be connected to? I think that particular proposition is the strongest one because it only requires two assumptions, or it only really asks two questions. Is, did they make it into North America? Are they still around? And if the answer to those is yes, then that's likely what the Sasquatch is. Now, all these other candidates, they require many, many, many more assumptions, and you'd have to answer many more questions in the affirmative for that to work. And so, I understand why people lean towards their various interpretations, that it could be something within the genus Homo, like humans, or a human relative, or something closely related. I know people very often point to Paranthropus or some of these other genera, but I think that's the most likely solution based on what we have thus far. And so to me, that's sort of the model that makes the most sense to me, and that if I had to make a prediction, I think that they would be related to that clade of large apes.
The evidence base that's out there, I mean, there are sightings that people have, but by far there's more in the way of the sound, like you heard, more of that evidence. More people have those types of experiences, it seems like. And sometimes they hear sounds that sound something like chatter, sound something like the Sierra sounds. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very interesting because, yeah, I mean, sounds make up the bulk of the general claims because they're not as dependent on proximity as, visual observation is. You have to be fairly close to an animal, or at least have an unobstructed line of sight in order to see it. And you don't get that very often in dense forests versus, you could be some distance away from something to hear it, depending on how loud it is. And sounds are very difficult because they are subjective to some degree, unless they've been recorded and they can be subsequently analyzed. But, as someone who sort of lives in the world of sound, because, I've played music most of my life and engineered and recorded a lot of music and played live and attended a lot of concerts and been now producing podcasts for this long, it's interesting to encounter across these different iterations of this sort of sound-based world, the way that people describe the same sound, or the way that people interpret the same. If a lot of people are hearing a sound simultaneously, they'll use wildly different language to describe it, or they'll different nomenclature, let's say, or they'll interpret it differently, what they attribute it to, et cetera. And so when we're talking about the natural world, that's basically, there's a finite number of animals in North America, but it might as well to the individual be infinite, because there are so many species, and many species have produced such a variety of sounds. And then there's individual variations among those animals that in the sounds that they'll produce. And so it's not like all coyotes sound exactly the same or make exactly the same sound. And then we, let alone to move into the realm of birds, because there's so many bird species and they produce such a variety of sounds. And so I think it's really difficult when you're working with people's descriptions of what they heard. Because very often people articulate those differently, and then we as interpreters, we're interpreting that based on our own familiarity, our own skills. And so there's a whole lot of variables at play, and many of which are confounding and just almost like irreconcilable. So I do think we could easily say that, not all of the sounds that have been attributed to Sasquatches are likely to be attributed to anything unknown. People just aren't. I mean, I'm not familiar with every sound that every animal in North America makes. And people will have sent me sound files over the years of things that were new to them, but might be something like the territorial dispute call of the barred owl, which sounds very primate-like. If you've ever heard two barred owls, two or more sometimes come together, and it's called their territorial dispute call, and it really sounds like monkeys very often. And so people who are only used to the typical, who cooks for you owl call, when they hear that, they don't immediately associate it with an owl. And because it's primate-like, they think they're hearing some kind of primate. So many, many times over the years, I've gotten sound files from people. What do you think this is? And, oh, that's a barred owl, and show them other examples. So there are other animals in the woods that produce, chatter, let's say. So I tend to stick to the sounds that are not easily, attributed to other animals. Like, for example, the bellowing, moaning howl that is colloquially referred to as the Ohio howl, because the first recorded instance of it was 1994 map moneymaker in Ohio, in I think Columbiana County. And it's this deep, it rises in pitch until it hits a certain note, and then it descends. People describe it as sounding somewhat like an air siren, air raid siren. And I've heard that sound myself, I think 11 different times across North America over these many years, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nights of being out. So I can say, well, some animal produces that sound. And that's probably the most commonly recorded one as well, which makes sense, because if that's one of the loudest sounds that's being generated by these things, well, you don't have to be very close to hear it. Now, I know many people who have claim to have had encounters, let's say, and heard that speech-like sounds very similar to the Sierra sounds. I've heard it myself once in association with other activity. There were also powerful wood knocks, and then, this really beautiful close proximity whoop similar to the Sierra sound. So I would associate those events. While I heard this speech-like sound in conjunction with these other, typical, let's say, Sasquatch behaviors and Sasquatch related sounds. So I do think that if they exist, again, they make these speech-like sounds. Now, whether or not they constitute language, or if they're protolingual or something of that nature, I think that's yet to be seen. I know Scott Nelson has done work on the Sierra sounds, and there are other people with similar skill sets or backgrounds that either have small differences of opinion or large differences of opinion. So I think the jury's still out, and more work needs to be done on what those sounds represent. But it is fascinating. I'd love to hear more of it in the field. I just came back from a few days in the field and was relating some of the, the anecdotes that I'd heard over the years. And, some of the ones that really, because we're all motivated by those things that give us a response. If you hear a story that really gets under your skin, it tends to stick with you. And there are a number of these reports where people claim to have, made sounds on a regular basis. And if there are Sasquatches in proximity, the Sasquatches start to mimic that sound, or something is, out there mimicking that sound. And so there's the Elkins Creek case in central Georgia that resulted in this beautiful track cast. It's a long story, but essentially the witnesses had a Chihuahua, I believe it was a small dog named Peanut, and they would let the dog out, and it would use the bathroom, and they would call to it, Peanut, 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 and call to it to come back. And then supposedly, they claim this thing would come around at night and move around their trailer and go, Peanut, 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 ostensibly mimicking the sound it had heard. And then there's the famous Zuby's case from San Diego County in California, where the prominent Dr. Bador claimed that, they would go out and feed their chickens, and he had gone out one night and heard this thing say to him, like, here, chickie, chickie, which is just terrifying to imagine. So those stories stick with you. But it's an interesting proposition to think that, maybe it does represent something protolingual, but I just don't think we're there yet. But yeah, the claims of those sounds and recording of such sounds are definitely interesting.
They can be very complex, but there's very little of it out there that I've heard about anyway, that is lengthy enough and not even context as to what is creating the sound to really associate it even with a Sasquatch potentially.
Certainly. And you think if they do produce such sounds, they would be heard rarely, again, because you would have to be pretty close to hear a sound like that. You'd have to be within a certain proximity in order to detect that sound, versus if they make these huge bellowing, moaning howls at the top of their lungs, let's say, then of course that's what most people will hear and most people will record, because, you don't have to be close. You could be at a distance to hear that and put up a recorder or your phone or your camcorder or whatever and capture those sounds.
There's also some very interesting sounds with the clicking noises, and of course the whoops. Those are definitely something associated with the Sasquatch potentially, and response sounds where someone's putting out a sound and then they respond back in some way. I don't know that we have enough information to say that what that communication is, but it does seem to be some kind of a communication going on between them, because there'll be one of them in one area, and then they get a response, completely from another direction. Have you studied that very much?
Well, I've experienced that myself, in generating sounds and then getting responses from what seem to be two individuals, spread out, maybe a few hundred yards or several hundred feet or something of that nature. And then those claims, those reports do exist. So certainly, any animal that's generating sound to another of its kind is communicating something, whether that's just a location like, hey, I'm over here, where are you? Whether it's something, maybe more complex, or, some sort of like a mating call where it's indicating, like a motivated sort of a sound, like many animals do that have, large home ranges and are mobile in those home ranges to find mates during crucial times. Of course, they have to call out to them. And so mating calls might be differentiated from just other calls, but they're certainly not out there just randomly making sounds to amuse themselves, because few animals would do that. So those sounds have some sort of utility. They're practical in some way, and this variety of sounds, maybe each one of them has a different practical application, again, a location, or to express some sort of motivated, again, mating, or maybe it's something related to when they obtain food, that they're signaling to others that we've located a resource. Chimpanzees, for example, have vocalizations that are, I think, directly tied, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've looked into this, but tied to the limbic system. So they're almost involuntary emotional responses. So when they'll locate food, they'll cry out. And so other animals, as they're spread out and foraging, they'll hear that, and then they converge on the food source. And so sounds can have a variety of different uses and different meanings. And so depending on the complexity of these animals, that'd be one of the interesting questions, is that, once, if they're discovered, let's say tomorrow, well, we might not understand these things for another decade or 2 decades. So there's a lot of mystery still yet. But again, first we'd have to demonstrate that they exist, and that any of these sounds that are attributed to them actually are being generated by them. That we just don't know yet for certain.
Yeah, very few people have had that experience where they're actually viewing a Sasquatch at the time they're hearing a lot of those sounds. For the most part, they seem to be very distant from population human beings. They tend to move in an opposite direction, and yet you hear story after story of campsites where it appears that they're curious and they're close by, and they may come roaming through the campsite during the middle of the night or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was really focused on those sort of reports, especially from like 2012 to 2013, because I did spend a year focused full time on trying to get some sort of visual evidence. And mostly I was aimed at trying to get thermal footage at night, because, there's no more passive sort of system than the thermal imager, because it's not emitting anything, and it doesn't require an illuminator or some kind of light source. And so you would think, well, I mean, there are these interesting thermal clips that, may or may not be legitimate and show living Sasquatches. But one of the frustrating things is that, any sort of 2D image is difficult. And then thermal imaging, because it's monochromatic, becomes even more difficult to sort of interpret, especially for people that haven't spent a lot of time looking through thermal imagers. And then very often, they're in these dense forests. And so you're just seeing a number of trees, and then this heat signature sort of peeking out, and there's no real determinant of like, well, what am I really looking at here? How do I know that's not human sized or a person? But if you do look at certain subsets of reports, there are these reports of like campsite visitations, and they have some fairly consistent contexts and commonalities, and that, very often they are inside of viable habitat, large tracts of it, where you have campgrounds or some sort of recreation area, and maybe years or decades even of human usage of these areas. And so you'd think that, well, if they're out there and they're smart or have any degree of intelligence, that they would sort of pattern these things and figure them out, not unlike bears, because bears in these areas will figure those things out and start to exploit these human food resources, whether that's raiding coolers, raiding trash bags, raiding dumpsters or trash bins. And lo and behold, there are many Sasquatch claims that describe exactly that at least in some places they will repeatedly, infiltrate a camp at night. And hypothetically, you'd think, well, that'd be a great score, because human food is pretty rich in a lot of things, whether it's, sugar rich, which we see a lot of that obviously in human foods. The greatest concentration of sugar in the natural world here would be like honey, and you're not going to get that much of it at once, and it's not that easy to get. And so, would you rather dig up, here in the Southeast, in fact, we just ran into one the other day. You know, you'll have these beehives that are buried underground. You'll see where bears have excavated them, and it's never a good idea to go poking in one of those holes like we did the other day. Oh, what's this bear been digging? And then a whole bunch of bees come flying out and you have to run. So you think that Sasquatches, if they figured out some easy way to get these human food resources, might make a habit of it, at least certain individuals. I don't think species wide they do that, but let's say if there's an individual or two in a certain area and they've just figured out over the years that, hey, every once in a while, a bunch of people come into this place and all these dumpsters fill up pretty quick and then they all bug out and go home. And now there's all this food waste that they can access, or again, while the people are there snooping around at night. So I was focused on that because it's like, well, if you could find a situation where Sasquatches are voluntarily approaching humans, you know, man-made objects like vehicles or tents or, you know, whatever's at a campground, you know, again, trash bins, dumpsters, picnic tables, etc. Well, that's the best place to install some sort of cameras, or to at least have some sort of surveillance, whether it's night vision or thermal imaging, because they're voluntarily approaching versus, you know, you infiltrating their core areas, let's say, or intruding into their territory and then leaving up technology or something like that that has to be retrieved. And then the other advantage of that would be, I mean, can you imagine if someone got good video of a Sasquatch raiding a dumpster or going through people's coolers, because it wouldn't just be juxtaposed against a bunch of trees. Like you'd see it walking in the frame with other man-made items of known size, like maybe walking behind a vehicle or near a tent or, again, a picnic table. And then there'd be no question about how big the individual is that you're looking at, because you'd have other objects of known size in there. And so I'm still very interested in that. It's just a sort of a trickier thing to pursue because, you know, there might be primitive sites that are viable for that sort of, let's say, research, or at least those sort of tactics of trying to get footage. But otherwise, it's like you're just going to recreation areas where there have been reports and, you know, you're having to deal with other people and other campers. And, you know, I used to mount all these thermal imagers on my vehicle so they would look like they were just part of the vehicle. Because if they're willing to approach a vehicle, you know, what's this extra appendage? It shouldn't be that off-putting, you know, versus a camera way out in the woods or some device, you know, out in their territory. But of course, people are like, you know, what's this person with all these cameras over their car doing? And so it's a difficult thing. But no, I do think that there is something to those claims. It makes sense from a behavioral standpoint because we see the same thing with other animals. And again, bears being the greatest example of that, I would say. And it is something that should be explored and exploited more often. A lot of reports along those lines, reports of that nature. And then, you know, Mike Green, who recently passed, you know, his thermal footage is essentially of something within that sort of context where, I mean, the whole reason the BFRO started going to that particular campground in the Uaris is because there were a number of reports of them, Sasquatches, purportedly infiltrating this camp in the dark. And, you know, I was there with the BFRO in 2007 in May. And then the following March was Mike Green's first trip there. And that's where I first met him. And it's funny because we were trying things there around camp, and then this huge storm blew through and we had to sort of leave and go get shelter. I mean, it's basically, I don't know if it was a tornado, but it was like near tornado-like conditions, very rough. And then we came back after everything had settled and decided, well, maybe we should go to a different area because it had been quiet there for a few days. Not much had happened. So we all left except for a few people that stayed in camp. All the vehicles left, basically. And Mike was one of the people that stayed in camp. You could read about this in his book. And, you know, something came up that hill to that same campsite, you know, as if it was something it had done regularly, you know, trying to, oh, all the humans are gone. Is there anything left around? Maybe is there something in these bins? And then a year later in 2009, you know, Mike got that thermal footage of what's perhaps the same individual walking the same path to the same campsite. So I think that's an avenue that should be continually explored. And, you know, if they do exist, that'd be one great way to get footage or some kind of visual evidence. You know, I'd been toying with the idea of writing a book for a long time. I actually started a project years ago that maybe I'll finish one day, but it was going to be specifically focused on the history of observation and encounter claims and evidence in the Southern Appalachians, specifically Northeast Georgia, Western North Carolina, East Tennessee. So maybe I'll finish that one day. But then about 3 years ago, I started a different project, like I described earlier, trying to create what I would hope to be the most comprehensive book that I'm capable of that's an overview of the entire subject. And so that came out this June, The Phenomenal Sasquatch, and it is available on Amazon. So it's in print format as well as digital. There will be an audiobook at some point in the future, but that's quite a ways off. And then Cliff Barrickman does sell autographed copies through the North American Bigfoot Center as well. But, there's a lot of information in here, and hopefully people that are interested could find it and would find it useful. I've gotten a lot of great feedback, which I'm very thankful and very grateful for. And so if anyone's interested in digging into that further, they can find The Phenomenal Sasquatch on Amazon.